In the winter of 1943, the German Sixth Army was trapped in an icy hell in Stalingrad, surrounded by the relentless advance of the Red Army. Without supplies, enduring sub-zero temperatures, and with soldiers weakened by hunger and disease, the situation was desperate. One of these generals was Alexander von Hartmann, commander of the 71st Infantry Division, who died as a German hero. True to his principles, he declared, "I intend to go with my infantry to the front line. I will seek death among their ranks. To be captured is dishonorable for a general." He fulfilled his word on the 26th of January 1943, facing the enemy standing and firing his rifle until the last moment when a bullet ended his life. Such were the final days of the German generals trapped in the hell of Stalingrad. Alexander von Hartmann, the general who chose to die with honor. Alexander von Hartmann, born on the 11th of December 1890 in Berlin, was a German general who played a prominent role during World War II. Commander of the 71st Infantry Division of the Wehrmacht, his military career was marked by a series of successes that culminated in his participation in the brutal Battle of Stalingrad, where he met his tragic end on the 26th of January 1943. With the outbreak of World War II, Hartmann took command of the 71st Infantry Division. Under his leadership, the division participated in several significant campaigns, including the invasion of France and operations on the Eastern Front. From September of 1942, his division was at the forefront of the fighting, leading offensives that broke through the city's suburbs and reached the Volga River. However, these initial victories came at a high cost, as the German lines were stretched dangerously thin and became exposed to Soviet attacks. Von Hartmann, recognized for his leadership, was awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross on the 8th of October 1942, an honor that marked the beginning of his final months in combat. When the Soviet forces launched Operation Uranus on the 19th of November 1942, the Sixth Army was completely surrounded in Stalingrad. By the 23rd of November, German troops, including the 71st Infantry Division, were trapped with no possibility of escape. Despite air supply attempts and relief efforts, the situation rapidly deteriorated. In December, with the encirclement tightening and resources running low, von Hartmann was promoted to Lieutenant General, a recognition of his unwavering leadership amidst the collapse. The morning of the 26th of January, 1943, dawned bleak and frozen in Stalingrad. The Soviet encirclement had closed even tighter, and the German Sixth Army was on the brink of collapse. For Alexander von Hartmann, commander of the 71st Infantry Division, the situation was desperate. His command post, located near the train station, had been completely surrounded by Soviet forces. With no way out and no reinforcements in sight, von Hartmann knew that the end was imminent. In an act of leadership and calm, he gathered his remaining officers and men in the command post. Aware of the gravity of the situation, he spoke to them with unwavering determination. "It is a matter of pride when an officer dies in battle, but in this case I will not commit suicide. I will sell my life as dearly as possible." These words, filled with resignation and courage, marked the spirit with which they would face their final moments. Grabbing a rifle, von Hartmann left the command post and headed toward the railroad embankment in the southern sector. There, accompanied by the remaining members of his personal guard, composed of 3 officers, 7 non-commissioned officers, and 183 soldiers, he chose to stand and fight. He positioned himself at the front like any other soldier and began firing at the advancing Soviet forces. The scene was one of bravery and tragedy. A general, armed like an infantryman, facing an enemy that far outnumbered and outgunned his forces. Finally, at 8 o'clock in the morning, Alexander von Hartmann fell in battle. A bullet struck him directly in the head, fulfilling his wish to die as a soldier and not as a prisoner. His death was swift, occurring in front of his men, who continued to fight in his memory. Alongside von Hartmann, 2 of his closest officers also died. Lieutenant Colonel Kurt Corduan, commander of the 191st Regiment, and Major August Bayerlin, commander of the 211th Regiment. Both shared the fate of their general, fighting until their last breath in defense of a cause that was already lost. However, their sacrifice did not change the inevitable outcome. The The remaining forces of the 71st Division continued to fight in the days that followed in the area between Yelchanka and Voroponovo, but the division was practically destroyed. After his death, Hartmann was posthumously promoted to the rank of General of Infantry, a recognition of his dedication and service. Richard Stemple, the general who chose honor. General Richard Stemple, commander of the 371st Infantry Division, spent his final days in Stalingrad with the certainty that the fate of the Sixth Army was sealed. Amid the chaos, exhaustion, and mounting Soviet pressure, Stemple, like many other generals, had to face desperate decisions while attempting to maintain his honor and that of his men. On the 19th of January 1943, Richard Stemple had a crucial meeting with Colonel General Friedrich Paulus, commander of the Sixth Army, in a bunker near the front. During this meeting, witnessed by Stemple's son Joachim, Paulus openly acknowledged that the army was doomed to total destruction. According to Joachim's testimony, Paulus, tired and disheartened, subtly suggested to Stemple that he should consider taking his own life before falling into Soviet hands. "A German general knows what he must do as a last resort," Paulus said, while reaffirming that he himself would resist with his staff until the very end. However, it is ironic that Paulus, a devout Christian, later rejected suicide when promoted to field marshal by Hitler, claiming he would not betray his religious beliefs. This double standard, according to Joachim's memoirs, deeply influenced his father's decision. On the 25th of January, just hours before the end, Joachim had the opportunity to bid farewell to his father in an emotionally charged meeting. Father and son sat face to face in the bunker, aware that it was likely the last time they would see each other. Joachim, a lieutenant in the 108th Panzer Grenadier Regiment, asked, "And now what, father?" Richard, exhausted and disappointed, responded calmly, "The end is very near. We've been abandoned. We won't see our homeland again. But you, son, try to break the encirclement. Fight as an honest soldier until the last moment." At that moment, the general made it clear that he would not attempt to escape or surrender, as he believed his place was with his fallen soldiers. With a final hug and words of farewell, Joachim left, knowing it would be the last time he saw his father alive. The psychological pressure on Stemple grew when he mistakenly believed that his son had died while attempting to break the Soviet encirclement. Although Joachim survived the escape attempt, wounded, Stemple acted under the false assumption that his son had perished. This misunderstanding, combined with Paulus's insistence that a general should not be captured, pushed Stemple toward a fateful decision. In the early hours of the 26th of January 1943, General Richard Stemple, after meeting with his officers and discussing the impossibility of continuing the fight, made his final decision. Considering himself physically exhausted and unable to attempt an escape, he stated that he would not allow himself to be captured alive by the Soviets. "I'd rather shoot myself because the surrender of a German general is not considered. I belong to my fallen soldiers," he declared. Hours later, in the bunker he shared with his officers and military chaplains, Stemple took his pistol and shot himself, fulfilling his promise not to abandon his men. His tragic end was the result of a combination of external pressure, the collapse of his forces, and a deep sense of military honor. His son, Joachim Stemple, survived the encirclement and years later documented the events in his book Diesen Weg sind wir gegangen, This Path We Walked. In it, he not only details his father's story but also the desperate atmosphere of Stalingrad, where sacrifice and honor faced the relentless reality of defeat. The tragic fate of Fritz Rosker, the commander of the 194th Regiment. Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich Fritz Rosker, commander of the 194th Infantry Regiment of the 71st Infantry Division of the German Army, played a key role in the most brutal battle of World War II, Stalingrad. A veteran of World War I, Rosker rejoined the army in 1934 and courageously led his men in several campaigns before voluntarily requesting command on the Eastern Front. In September of 1942, he was assigned to the offensive of the Sixth Army, led by Friedrich Paulus, with the objective of capturing the Soviet city. Rosker commanded his battalions with determination, facing a fierce enemy and the chaos of urban warfare. On the 12th of September 1942, he led a key attack towards the center of Stalingrad, managing to reach the Volga despite enormous losses, including an accidental bombing by the Luftwaffe that destroyed one of his companies. However, the German advances were met with the relentless resistance of the Soviets, led by General Alexander Rodimtsev and his 13th Guard Rifle Division. The battle turned into a house-to-house slaughter, with attacks and counterattacks that drained the resources and morale of both sides. With the arrival of the Russian winter, temperatures in the Volga region dropped to extreme levels, reaching -20 degrees Celsius in November of 1942. The men of the 6th Army, surrounded by Soviet troops in the ruins of Stalingrad, endured unbearable conditions both physically and emotionally. In a letter to his wife, Rosk wrote, "Our men fulfill their duty day and night without rest in this hell. Food is scarce and rest is impossible. Last night I brought chocolates and cigarettes for everyone. I had saved them for when the situation became even more critical." This letter was written just days after the 19th of November 1942, when Soviet General Georgy Zhukov launched a powerful counterattack on the weakened German flanks. The operation, known as Uranus, closed the encirclement around the 6th Army, trapping over 300,000 soldiers in a maneuver that would change the course of the war. Roske was well aware of the gravity of the situation. Zhukov had to take it, and we had to defend what we had. As commander on the front of the 71st Infantry Division, Roske was a direct witness to the bloodiest fighting that took place in Stalingrad. The troops of both sides fought ferociously in an urban war, where buildings were taken floor by floor, room by room. The final defeat came on the 31st of January 1943, when Paulus ordered the surrender. Roske led the meeting with the Soviets while holding on to a moment of personal joy. He had just received the news that his wife had given birth to their 5th child. Despite the terrible circumstances, this small comfort allowed him to continue with dignity. In his last letter, he wrote, "The morale of our regiment is wonderful. We are very proud to be part of this community of true men in Stalingrad." After the surrender, Roske was captured and judged as a war criminal by the Soviets. He spent 12 years in various labor camps in Siberia, the Urals, and the Caucasus. Finally, in 1955, he returned home to Düsseldorf, where he attempted to rebuild his life. However, the weight of trauma, the losses endured, and the experiences in captivity led him to a tragic end. On Christmas Day of 1956, Roske took his own life, leaving behind his wife and 5 children. Friedrich Conrad Winkler, a life lost in Stalingrad. Friedrich Conrad Winkler was born on the 22nd of August, 1909, in Worms, one of the oldest cities in Germany, located along the Rhine River. From a young age, he dedicated himself to military life, becoming a professional soldier with 12 years of service, known in German as a Zwölfender. His military career was marked by continuous promotions, advancing to Oberleutnant, first lieutenant, in November of 1941 and finally to Hauptmann, captain, in December of 1942 during World War II. In the middle of 1942, Winkler was transferred to the 305th Infantry Division from his previous unit, the Infantry Regiment 56. He initially served in the Stabs Company of the Infantry Regiment 577, which was later renamed Grenadier Regiment 577 in October of that same year. He later assumed command of the 6th Company of his regiment, facing intense combat at the Barricadi Armaments Factory, located to the north of Stalingrad. The factory, one of the city's strategic points, became the epicenter of brutal clashes between German and Soviet troops, a place where every meter gained or lost meant enormous human sacrifices. The 305th Infantry Division, including Winkler's unit, was completely annihilated in January of 1943 during the Soviet encirclement. Winkler was captured in February of that same year, after resisting until the very end alongside his men. His captivity led him to the Beketovka prisoner of war camp, where the conditions were extremely harsh. There, weakened by deprivation and the physical toll of the fighting, he died shortly afterward. He was only 34 years old. During his military career, Winkler was a distinguished and courageous soldier. He was awarded the Infantry Assault Badge, the Iron Cross, 1st and 2nd class, the Silver Wound Badge, the Winter Campaign Medal in Russia, 1941 to 1942, and the War Merit Cross, 2nd class. Each of these decorations represented his dedication and the suffering he endured in the bloodiest combats of the war. A photograph taken during operations at Barricadi in October of 1942 shows Winkler with a face marked by exhaustion, reflecting the terrible experiences he lived through in Stalingrad. In the image, he is seen wearing shoulder straps of a rank-and-file soldier with officer cufflinks, possibly to avoid being an easy target for enemy snipers. He also wore 6x30 binoculars, essential for coordinating attacks in the complex urban terrain. His infantry assault badge is shown broken, a symbol that, according to some veterans, served as a mark of honor for those who had survived countless assaults in the hell of Stalingrad. The fate of Friedrich Konrad Winkler is a reflection of the tragedy of thousands of soldiers trapped in Stalingrad, a place where valor and resilience collided with the relentless reality of war. Although his name may not appear in the great books of history, his personal story reminds us of the sacrifice of those who faced one of the bloodiest battles of World War II. Winkler, like many others, died far from home, leaving behind a legacy of service and sacrifice that deserves to be remembered. Walther von Seydlitz-Kurzbach, the rebel general of Stalingrad. Walther von Seydlitz-Kurzbach was one of the most controversial generals of World War II, particularly for his role during the Battle of Stalingrad. His defiant stance against Hitler's orders and his decisions during the encirclement of the Sixth Army made him a key figure in the tragedy of Stalingrad. In June of 1942, Seydlitz assumed command of the Sixth Army's LI Corps, which was part of the Sixth Army under the leadership of Friedrich Paulus. This corps played a central role in the German assault on Stalingrad during the Case Blue operation, the major summer offensive on the Eastern Front. In September of 1942, his troops advanced into the city's suburbs and, along with other units, managed to occupy 90% of Stalingrad, dividing Soviet forces into small pockets of resistance. However, the German advance stalled due to the fierce Soviet resistance and the brutal urban combat. As the LI Corps fought to capture the last strongholds on the banks of the Volga, the Soviets were planning a massive counter-offensive. On the 19th of November, 1942, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus, a surprise attack that surrounded the Sixth Army by breaking through the German flanks, which were mostly defended by poorly equipped Romanian troops. By the 23rd of November, Soviet troops had closed the encirclement at Kalach, trapping more than 250,000 German soldiers, including Seydlitz's corps. As the situation deteriorated, Seydlitz was one of the few generals who openly advocated for an immediate retreat. He argued that the troops should break the encirclement and save as many men as possible, even if it meant disobeying Hitler's direct orders. However, this proposal was rejected both by Paulus and the German High Command, who insisted on adhering to the order to resist at all costs. As the situation within the encirclement worsened, Seydlitz took a more defiant stance. On the 25th of January, 1943, he made the decision to release his division commanders so they could act independently and surrender if necessary to save lives. This action was seen as a serious act of insubordination, and Paulus removed him from command, transferring his divisions to General Walter Heitz. Despite his removal, Seydlitz continued advocating for surrender to prevent further suffering. However, his efforts were in vain, as most commanders continued to obey Hitler's orders to fight until the end. By the last days of January 1943, the Sixth Army had been divided into several isolated pockets. The central group, which included Seydlitz's 51st Corps, was one of the last to surrender. On the 31st of January, Paulus officially surrendered to the Red Army, and Seydlitz was captured along with other senior German officers. At the time of his capture, Seydlitz was one of the few generals who had actively opposed Hitler's orders in Stalingrad, earning him the contempt of some of his fellow officers. After his capture, Seydlitz was taken to a prisoner of war camp in the Soviet Union. During his captivity, he adopted an even more radical stance against the Nazi regime. He joined the National Committee for a Free Germany and the Bund Deutscher Offiziere, Association of German Officers, organizations made up of German prisoners of war and exiled communists who sought to overthrow Hitler and end the war. Seydlitz advocated for the creation of a German military force that would fight alongside the Red Army against the Nazi regime, although this plan was never realized. After the war ended in 1945, Seydlitz refused to cooperate with the Soviet occupation of Germany, which led to his conviction in 1949 by the Soviet Union for war crimes committed by his troops. After several trials and enduring various new sentences, he was released by the Soviets in 1956. Seydlitz returned to Germany after nearly 14 years of absence and settled in Bremen, where he attempted to recover his property, have his rank reinstated, and secure the pension due to him as a general. However, he was unsuccessful in the latter two of these goals. Seydlitz barely managed to get the government of West Germany to annul the sentences imposed on him by the Third Reich in 1956. Unable to regain his military ranks and completely ignored by his former comrades, Walther von Seydlitz-Kurzbach passed away in Bremen on the 28th of April, 1976. In 1994, his descendants succeeded in having the military sentences imposed by the Soviet Union annulled by Russian courts. Walter Heitz, the general who embodies the fanaticism and tragedy of Stalingrad. Walter Heitz, born on December 8, 1878 in Berlin, was a career officer in the German army whose rigid support for Nazism and Adolf Hitler defined his trajectory during World War II. Despite his advanced age at the start of the conflict, Heitz insisted on actively participating in the front lines, a decision that would lead him to the inferno of Stalingrad and make him one of the most controversial figures of the battle. Heitz began his military career in the Prussian army in 1899, serving with distinction during World War I, where he rose to the rank of battalion commander and was awarded numerous decorations, including the Knight's Cross of the Order of Hohenzollern. After the war, he remained in military roles during the turbulent years of the Weimar Republic, standing out as an instructor at the Jüterbog Artillery School. During this time, he cultivated a reputation as an efficient and disciplined officer. With the rise of Nazism, Heitz eagerly embraced the regime's ideology, which allowed him to take key positions, such as president of the Reichskriegsgericht, the highest military tribunal of Nazi Germany, where he oversaw trials that reflected the hardening policies of the regime. In 1937, he was promoted to General der Artillerie, and at the start of World War II, he took command of the 8th Corps. In August 1942, Heitz's 8th Corps was assigned to the 6th Army under General Friedrich Paulus as part of the German strategic offensive towards southern Russia, known as Case Blue. This force aimed to capture Stalingrad, a vital city on the Volga River, and sever Soviet communication lines. During the advance, German forces, including Heitz's, captured 90% of the city, dividing the Soviet forces into two pockets. However, this apparent victory soon turned into a nightmare. On November 19, 1942, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus, a massive counteroffensive designed to encircle the 6th Army. The German flanks, defended by Romanian and Hungarian troops, collapsed rapidly. By November 23, Soviet forces completed the encirclement at Kalach, trapping over 300,000 German soldiers, including those of Heitz's 8th Corps. As conditions within the encirclement deteriorated, Heitz displayed absolute devotion to Hitler's orders. Strict orders were issued to prevent any attempts at surrender or communication with the Soviets. Heitz proclaimed the motto, "We fight until the penultimate bullet," reflecting his inflexible approach. When Walther von Seydlitz-Kurzbach, commander of another corps within the encirclement, allowed his divisions to surrender independently based on local conditions, Heitz considered it an act of treason. On January 25, 1943, Paulus relieved Seydlitz of his command and placed his divisions under Heitz's control. Attempts by Seydlitz and other officers to surrender led to them being shot at by Heitz's troops. Seydlitz later claimed that 2 officers died due to these apocalyptic orders. On January 29th, in a desperate attempt to maintain discipline, Heitz ordered, "Anyone who surrenders will be shot. Anyone who raises a white flag will be shot. Anyone who doesn't immediately hand over bread or sausages thrown by our pilots will be shot. These drastic directives exemplified the moral collapse within the encirclement. On January 26, 1943, German forces in Stalingrad split into two pockets, one to the north and one to the south of Mamayev-Kurgan. Heitz was left in command of the central pocket, which included the 8th and 51st Corps. As Soviet forces advanced, the central pocket was reduced to a small nucleus. Amid the despair, Heitz declared he would seek death as a soldier defending his position, but attempted suicide at the last moment, only to be stopped by his chief of staff. On January 30th, in a symbolic attempt to boost morale, Hitler promoted Heitz to the rank of Generaloberst. However, the fate of the 8th Corps had already been sealed. On January 31st, Heitz formally surrendered, becoming the second highest-ranking German officer to be captured after Friedrich Paulus. After his capture, Heitz was sent to a prisoner of war camp in Moscow where conditions were extremely harsh. He refused to cooperate with the National Committee for a Free Germany, an organization made up of anti-Nazi German prisoners seeking to overthrow Hitler. His resistance resulted in brutal beatings and threats against his family by the Soviets. A notable event occurred in April 1943 when a letter written by Heitz unexpectedly reached his wife through Turkey, due to a censorship error in Vienna. This letter, later published by his wife, contradicted the official Nazi propaganda glorifying heroic deaths in Stalingrad. Its content fueled doubts about the Nazi narrative and highlighted the despair within the encirclement. Weakened by captivity and illness, Heitz died of cancer in Moscow on February 9, 1944. His life and legacy were marked by fanatical loyalty to the Nazi regime, a leadership that led to drastic and controversial decisions in Stalingrad, and a tragic death far from his homeland. Karl Strecker, the last bastion of Stalingrad. Karl Strecker was born on September 20, 1884, in Radmansdorf, the son of a Prussian officer who was gravely wounded during the Franco-Prussian War and, suffering from intense pain, committed suicide in 1893. Although Strecker initially aspired to follow in his grandfather's footsteps and become an evangelical pastor, the lack of financial resources in his family, consisting of his widowed mother and 6 children, led him to join the Koslin Cadet Academy at the age of 12. There he excelled particularly in history and Russian, earning good grades. On March 14, 1905, Strecker was appointed as a lieutenant in the Deutschordens Infantry Regiment No. 152 of the Prussian Army in Marienburg. His military career progressed quickly. In 1911, he became a battalion aide, and by June 1914, a regiment aide, eventually being promoted to first lieutenant just before the outbreak of World War I. During the Great War, Strecker fought on the Eastern Front, participating in the Battle of Tannenberg and in offensives on the territory of the Russian Empire. Throughout the conflict, he took on various roles, including company and battalion commander, as well as staff officer. In 1915, he was promoted to captain and transferred to the German General Staff's Railway Transport Department. In the following years, he participated in the invasion of Romania and the Battle of the Aisne, 1917, though he suffered serious injuries in a car accident. After recovering, he returned to the front as a staff officer in the 30th Infantry Division. For his distinguished service, he received the Iron Cross First and Second Class. After the armistice of 1918, Strecker resumed command of his regiment in Silesia, where he participated in suppressing local uprisings. In 1920, he was discharged from the army with the honorary rank of major due to the post-World War I reduction in troops. He later joined the security police, holding various positions in Münster, Potsdam, and Berlin, and was appointed commander of the police school in Münster in 1931. With the establishment of the Nazi regime and the reinstatement of compulsory military service in 1935, Strecker returned to military service as a division general. During the early years of World War II, he commanded the 79th Infantry Division, participating in the campaigns in Poland, France, and the Balkans. During the invasion of the Soviet Union, his unit fought on the Eastern Front, and in 1941 he was awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross for his leadership. In 1942 he was promoted to General of Infantry and assumed command of the 11th Army Corps. Strecker took command of the 11th Corps during the German advance towards Stalingrad and led his troops in the most intense fighting in the city. With a mixture of weakened infantry and exhausted troops, he entrenched his forces in the northern sector, where they faced constant Soviet attacks. In January 1943, when the German flanks began to collapse under Operation Uranus, Strecker found himself surrounded along with the remaining forces of the Sixth Army, while the Südkessel, southern pocket, commanded by Friedrich Paulus, surrendered on January 31st. Strecker and his men in the Nordkessel, northern pocket, continued to fight, isolated and with no hope of reinforcements. Strecker gained notoriety for his firm refusal to surrender immediately, despite the lack of supplies and the extreme cold that killed both soldiers and civilians. On February 1st, 1943, a Wehrmacht report acknowledged his bravery, stating, "The Nord Group under the command of General of Infantry Strecker continues to resist." It repelled strong enemy attacks, some even through counterattacks. However, by February 2nd, 1943, with the situation completely untenable, Strecker finally capitulated along with the last 11,000 soldiers of his sector. After his surrender, Strecker and his men were captured by the Red Army and sent to prisoner-of-war camps. Strecker was transferred to the special Wojkowo camp, a facility reserved for high-ranking officers. Conditions in the Soviet camps were extremely harsh. Hunger, disease, and the bitter cold claimed the lives of thousands of prisoners, including many of Strecker's subordinates. Despite this, Strecker survived due to his determination and adaptability. During his captivity, Strecker witnessed Soviet efforts to use German officers for propaganda purposes. Although initially staunchly anti-communist and reluctant to cooperate in December 1944, he signed the Appeal of the 50 Generals, a document promoted by the National Committee for a Free Germany, urging Germans to abandon Hitler and end the war. This act, though controversial, reflected a shift in his view of the conflict and an acceptance of the futility of continuing to fight for a regime on the brink of collapse. Strecker spent more than a decade in captivity before being released on October 9, 1955 as part of the Heimkehr der 10.000, Return of the 10,000, a mass repatriation of German prisoners following Stalin's death. During his time in prison, Strecker wrote reflections and memoirs, later published by his grandson, which showed a shift toward accepting democracy and deep introspection about his role in the war. In his memoirs, Strecker expressed his acceptance of democracy and reflected on his inability to actively oppose Hitler. He spent his final years in Ida Oberstein and later in Riezlen, Austria, where he passed away on April 10, 1973. Hans Valentin Hube, the Iron General of the Third Reich. Hans Valentin Hube, born on October 29, 1890, in Naumburg an der Saale, was one of the most distinguished and respected generals of the Wehrmacht during World War II. His nickname, Der Mensch, the man, reflects the esteem his troops held for him and his reputation as an unyielding military leader. When World War II broke out, Hube commanded the 3rd Infantry Regiment during the invasion of Poland and later in the campaign in France, where he demonstrated outstanding leadership. Promoted to General Major in 1940, he took command of the 16th Panzer Division, which participated in Operation Barbarossa. In 1942, Hube was promoted to General Lieutenant and assumed command of the 14th Panzer Corps, playing a key role in the operations of the 6th Army at Stalingrad. His leadership during the advance along the Don River and the fighting in the suburbs of Stalingrad earned him the swords to his Knight's Cross, awarded by Adolf Hitler himself. However, when the Red Army launched Operation Uranus and encircled the 6th Army, Hube was evacuated from Stalingrad in January 1943, as Hitler considered him too valuable an officer to lose. Although he attempted to convince Hitler to allow a breakout from the encirclement, the Führer refused and ordered Paulus to resist at all costs. After the disaster at Stalingrad, Hube was sent to Sicily in 1943, where he led the defense of the island during the Allied invasion. Known for his tactical brilliance, he organized a meticulous retreat from Mount Etna to the Strait of Messina, evacuating over 40,000 German soldiers and large quantities of military equipment without the Allies being able to stop him. This success cemented his reputation as an exceptional strategist. In October 1943, Hube returned to the Eastern Front to lead the 1st Panzer Army, fighting against the relentless Soviet pressure. His efforts to halt the advance of the Red Army in Ukraine earned him recognition from Hitler, who awarded him the diamonds to his Knight's Cross, one of the most prestigious decorations of the Third Reich. On April 1, 1944, Hans Valentin Hube, one of the Wehrmacht's most prominent generals, reached the rank of Generaloberst, a recognition of his leadership and successes in the campaigns of Sicily, Korsun, and the Kamenets-Podolsky pocket. On April 20th, he returned to Germany, where he was personally decorated by Adolf Hitler with the diamonds to his Knight's Cross, one of the highest military honors in the Third Reich. The following day, on April 21, 1944, Hube's career came to a tragic end. While traveling in a Heinkel He 11-1 to return to the Eastern Front, the plane crashed near Obersalzberg, the location of Hitler's Alpine residence Berghof. The accident was devastating and claimed the life of the renowned general, leaving the Wehrmacht without one of its most respected and effective leaders. On April 26, 1944, Hans Valentin Hube was given a state funeral in Berlin, a solemn event that reflected his status within the German High Command. Key figures of the Third Reich, including Hitler, Himmler, Dönitz, Keitel, and von Kluge, attended the ceremony to pay tribute to the general. Hitler himself saluted Hube's coffin, a gesture underscoring the importance of the military figure within the regime. After the funeral, Hans Hube's remains were interred in the Invalidenfriedhof Cemetery in Berlin, a place reserved for the most prominent figures in German military history. His grave, simple yet significant, stands as a reminder of his legacy in the Wehrmacht. Hermann Hoth and his role in Stalingrad. Hermann Hoth, one of the most prominent commanders of the German panzer forces, played a crucial role during the attempts to rescue the 6th Army during the Battle of Stalingrad. In command of the 4th Panzer Army, Hoth led the failed Operation Winter Storm, which aimed to break the Soviet encirclement trapping Friedrich Paulus's 6th Army in the city. In December 1942, after the 6th Army had been surrounded in Stalingrad following Operation Uranus, Hoth was tasked with leading a rapid advance to rescue the trapped forces. The mission faced multiple obstacles from the start: the extreme Russian winter, fierce resistance from the Red Army, and the depleted strength of the German forces after months of intense combat on the Eastern Front. The offensive, launched on December 12, 1942, initially showed promising progress. Hoth concentrated his forces on a powerful drive toward Stalingrad, managing to reach the Verkhnechumsky region, about 50 kilometers from the city. However, the Soviets, having learned from previous defeats, had reinforced their defenses. Hoth's advance was halted due to enemy counterattacks and constant pressure on the flanks of the Don Army Group, led by Erich von Manstein. On December 16, 1942, the Soviets launched Operation Little Saturn, a massive offensive against the Axis forces on the southern flank. This maneuver forced Hoth to divert critical resources to protect his lines, further weakening his rescue attempt. Despite Hitler's orders to continue the advance at all costs, Hoth was forced to halt the operation due to mounting casualties and the impossibility of breaking through Soviet lines. On December 24th, Operation Winter Storm was officially cancelled. Hoth's forces began to retreat toward Ukraine, leaving the 6th Army condemned to its fate in Stalingrad. The surrender of the 6th Army in January 1943 marked a turning point on the Eastern Front, revealing the vulnerability of the German forces in the face of Soviet determination. In July 1943, Hoth participated in the Battle of Kursk, but was forced to retreat and establish a defensive line in positions better suited to his weakened forces. Later, after failing to recapture Kiev, Hitler removed him from the front, accusing him of not making enough of an effort, and placed him in the Führer Reserve until the end of the war. After the conflict, Hoth was arrested and charged with war crimes. He was tried in Nuremberg alongside many other career officers and was sentenced to 15 years in prison on October 27, 1948. He was released 6 years later in the midst of the Cold War, when former German officers were deemed useful in the fight against the Soviet Union. In his retirement, he gained some notoriety as a writer of military history until his death in Goslar on January 26, 1971, at the age of 85. Friedrich Paulus, the general marked by Stalingrad. On January 31, 1943, Paulus surrendered his army, originally composed of 260,000 soldiers, of whom only 91,000 survived the Soviet encirclement. This decision marked a turning point in the war. The surrender of the Sixth Army was a devastating blow to the Nazis, and Adolf Hitler, deeply enraged, publicly despised Paulus. When the nerves fail, the only solution is to say, "I can't go on and kill oneself. He had a duty to commit suicide," Hitler declared upon learning of the surrender. Just before, in a calculated gesture, he had promoted Paulus to Field Marshal, expecting that Paulus would follow the tradition of never surrendering. However, the general chose life, making this the first and last time he disobeyed his Führer. The situation in Stalingrad had been a true hell for the German troops. During the Soviet encirclement, hunger, temperatures as low as -25 degrees Celsius, and the lack of supplies devastated the Sixth Army. Attempts at resupply promised by the Luftwaffe were futile. Of the 700 tons of supplies promised daily, only 100 reached the troops. The soldiers succumbed to the cold, hunger, and exhaustion, while some, desperate, preferred to commit suicide or wound themselves to be evacuated. After the surrender, Paulus was taken prisoner to the Soviet Union, where he was placed in a special camp near Moscow. While he was allowed to bring personal belongings, the 91,000 captured soldiers were left to their fate in Siberia, where most perished under inhumane conditions. During his captivity, Paulus was closely monitored by the NKVD, which sought information about his political stance. Despite his initial reluctance to collaborate, the failed assassination attempt on Hitler in July 1944 changed his perspective. Many of the conspirators, such as Claus von Stauffenberg, were figures he deeply respected, and this event led him to definitively distance himself from the Nazi regime. At Nuremberg, Paulus gave testimony that shocked the world, accusing high-ranking figures like Hermann Göring and Wilhelm Keitel of being the main culprits behind the criminal policies of the Third Reich. His statement was decisive and marked a turning point in the perception of the Nazi regime. However, this act turned him into a figure of hatred among many of his former comrades and German veterans who considered him a traitor. Despite this, Paulus seemed indifferent to the criticism, focusing on the hope of reuniting with his family, a wish that would take years to fulfill. After his release in 1953, Paulus decided to settle in Dresden in the German Democratic Republic, GDR, avoiding West Germany. His choice was motivated by distrust of the West and the fear of rejection by the German generals who had taken refuge there. In the GDR, although initially received with some suspicion, the regime used him as a political tool, organizing events where his figure served to promote the reunification of Germany under Soviet influence. However, his impact on German society was limited, and the shadow of his past in Stalingrad continued to haunt him. In the final years of his life, Paulus suffered from a degenerative muscle disease that left him completely paralyzed. Despite his physical deterioration, he had the opportunity to reunite with his daughter Olga and his grandchildren, bringing some comfort to his life. However, the death of his wife Elena in 1949, whom he had not been able to see during his captivity, was a wound that never healed. Friedrich Paulus died in Dresden on February 1, 1957, exactly 14 years after his capture at Stalingrad. He was buried with honors by the GDR regime, thus closing a chapter of his life that was always marked by controversy. His figure remains an example of the complexities and ethical dilemmas faced by military leaders during the war and its aftermath.